Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll get right to work this morning. Our reading and discussion of John Dowling's book, The History of Romanism. We're dealing with the rise of popery, and we're dealing specifically with the doctrine of demons called forbidding to marry, and the rise of monkery. One doctrine of demons leads to another, and all based on the general premise, the doctrine of demons, that it's better to remain celibate and chaste rather than to be married. Okay, and out of this grew organizations holding to that doctrine of demons, that is, monasteries of monks and convents for nuns, all chaste and celibate. And they're nothing but trouble in the world, as one would expect of something arising from a doctrine of demons. Okay, now these monks, as we covered yesterday on the program, all of a sudden felt oppressed. They had risen from a lowly status of just an oddity of the church to vast numbers of these observant monks who could no longer be just simply ignored. And so they broke up into great orders of monks, and this required monasteries to be built to house them and to focus all their efforts. And pretty soon they rose to even challenge the power of the bishops. They were so numerous and so widely respected among the quote-unquote Christian society for their sanctity and holiness. And so they applied to the papacy for protection from the so-called servitude or tyranny of the bishops. And the papacy saw this as a great opportunity to create an entire wing of the Roman Catholic Church dedicated to upholding the power and authority of the papacy and to extend his legal, moral, and spiritual jurisdiction all over the world. So these monasteries and nunneries, all these things that have arisen from the doctrine of demons now is in the world in vast numbers for the purpose of elevating and extending the papal power. The man of sin, the son of perdition, the Antichrist of the Bible, and of history, and of prophecy. That's what monasteries are for, to extend the papal power all over this world. Now, in subsection 26 on the top of page 91, we read very quickly all the monasteries, great and small, abbeys, priories, and nunneries, were exempted from the jurisdiction of the bishops. The two last were inferior sorts of monasteries and after subordinate and often subordinate to some abbey. Even the chapters of cathedrals, and consisting mostly of regulars on the like pretext, obtained exemption. Okay? Finally, whole orders such as the Benedictines, who were established in the 6th century, and others were exempted. Okay, so the papacy is exempting these people from jurisdiction, from the supervision and control of the local bishop, and they're direct servants of the Pope now. Okay, it says this effectually procured a prodigious augmentation to the pontifical authority, which now came to have a sort of disciplined troops in every place, defended and protected by the papacy, who in return were its defenders and protectors, serving as spies on the bishops as well as on the secular powers. Okay, so the monasteries, the monks, became the Pope's insiders. And they gave watch over the bishops. Okay? They were spies against the bishops and also spies on the secular powers, that is, the governments of the world. You've heard me talk about the shadow government. There's much talk in the conspiracy theory world about the shadow government. But one thing you'll notice about all these discussions, never once is it implied that the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy is indeed the shadow government. Okay? There's all sorts of speculation and conspiracy theories, but here we have recorded in history, Roman Catholic Church history, how these monasteries and nunneries and special orders of the Roman Catholic Church, the ultimate of which is the Jesuit order itself, are spies on not only the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church who write our laws, but also spies on our own government. So anywhere in the world where these bishops and the special orders, the monkish orders of the Roman Catholic Church exist, you have a shadow government. And we've learned this early on, long time ago, from other Protestant writers. Anytime a country ever let the Roman Catholic Church come in and freely establish its jurisdictions and assemble its bishops and appoint them over dioceses, they polluted themselves with a shadow government. That's the whole purpose of the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy. The Roman Catholic canon law demands that every man, woman, and child be subject to the Roman pontiff. And this is how it's done. The shadow government moves in. The bishops erect their jurisdictions, their bishoprics, and the monastic orders assist into subjugating the entire country to Roman Catholic canon law. There's your shadow government. It oversees the writing of laws for the land. It makes sure that everyone is subject to those laws, and with or without their knowledge, becoming, through obedience to those laws, subject of the Roman pontiff. Now, continuing, it says, they made the cause of the Pope their own and represented him as sort of a god to the ignorant multitude over whom they had gained a prodigious ascendant by the notion that generally prevailed of the sanctity of the monastic order. Okay? So just based on the reputation or the belief by the common ordinary people that these orders were sacrosanct and holy and dedicated to religious practice, they let them run all over them. It's a phony religiosity, a mask behind which the devil's do-gooders practice. They're not suspected. People innocently, governments innocently allow these religious organizations to take root in their country, and little do they suspect, because of the outward piety of these orders, that they've just given away their country. It happened to the United States. It happened to Great Britain. It happened to all Protestant countries, Germany. And it's a long-held fixture within Roman Catholic countries. Now, England has learned the hard way and many times tried to overthrow these monastic orders, to overthrow the bishops, to overthrow the Jesuits and kick them out of their country, and to make the practice of Roman Catholicism illegal. Understanding what a nation does when it allows Rome to come in and prosper and practice in the country. You have a gradual, if not an instantaneous, overthrow of the legitimate government, and especially if it's a Protestant government. All right, so England has fought 3 or 4 civil wars over this issue. Now, it's never been recognized widely in the United States what a threat Roman Catholicism is to this country. But here we see from the pages of history what happens when Rome gets control and how it gets control. Okay? The monastic orders made the cause of the Pope their own and represented him as sort of a god to the ignorant multitude. See, why are we ignorant? Because we forgot our Protestantism. We forgot what Protestantism is all about. It protests the Antichrist, and the Antichrist is the Papacy. Okay? With that knowledge, you can't be ignorant of the imminent threat that Popery is wherever it exists. Okay? So he said they made the cause of the Pope their own and represented him as sort of a god to the ignorant multitude over whom they had gained a prodigious ascendance by the notion that generally prevailed of the sanctity of the monastic order. Okay? Listen, the sins that are covered behind a cloak of religiosity and sanctity and piety are legion in the world. I'll tell you what, it's come, after so many years of research, it's come to me that the more pious an organization appears on its face, the more public it makes its charities and all of the quote-unquote holy and altruistic acts, the more corrupt it is. Okay? As a matter of fact, some of the most diabolical secret societies in the world have used the example of the Roman Catholic Church to hide their incalculable demonic origin. Okay? I call them the devil's do-gooders. And I'll just name one of them, one you're all familiar with. Freemasonry. The devil's do-gooders. All they have done is followed the example of the great monastic orders of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly the Jesuits. Okay? In the past, I've described Freemasonry as just the Protestant wing of the Jesuit order. Freemasonry publicly displays all of its good works. But if you do any research at all into the history of Freemasonry and its origins and its books, you discover that it serves Satan. Okay? Now, what about all the good works? They are publicly displayed so that if anyone doing their own research comes to understand the diabolical origin of Freemasonry, the diabolical purpose of Freemasonry, whole communities will stand up in their defense because they too are ignorant of the multitudinous sins. All they know about are the good works. So the good works of Freemasonry are simply a mask behind which one of the most diabolical organizations on the planet exists with public support. And God help anybody who stands up publicly and starts talking about the real Freemasonry and what it's all about. Same thing goes for the Roman Catholic Church. You stand up in protest against the Roman Catholic Church, you've got the bishops, you've got the Roman Catholic hierarchy, you've got the monks, the nuns, all the sacred orders of the Roman Catholic Church instantly have become your lethal enemies. And they are so well thought of for all their charitable works and all their outward appearances that even the press of the United States will defend them. So you find yourself literally digging your own grave to criticize either Freemasonry or Roman Catholicism. And when you break it all down and you come to the realization of what these two really are, they're just mirror images of one another. and they serve Satan. They do not serve the God of the Bible. The devil's do-gooders. And the papacy, the great god of the devil's do-gooders, uses all of these institutions, including Freemasonry, all the monkish orders, to extend and to elevate the papal power. It's Lucifer who they worship, and the physical manifestation on the earth of Lucifer or Satan is the papacy. We learned this from James A. Wiley, and we know this from Martin Luther and all the Protestant writers, that the papacy is simply a mask behind which Satan rules. All right? So the monastic orders made the cause of the Pope their own and represented him as sort of a god to the ignorant multitude over whom they had gained a prodigious ascendance by the notion that generally prevailed among society of the sanctity of the monastic order. Okay? Now, it is at the same time to be observed that this immunity of the monks was a fruitful source of licentiousness and disorder, and occasioned the great part of the vices with which they were afterwards so justly charged. So with all this power and with all this outward appearance of sanctity, they had license to do whatever they wanted. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And since they were emissaries of the Pope, they had absolute power, and by this they became licentious and disorderly and infinitely corrupt. Okay? And when the Jesuit order was created, it found all these monastic orders and their corruption and blamed the papacy for the downfall of the Roman Catholic Church at the time of the Protestant Reformation. That it was because of all this corruption that the world was so widely aware of at the time that the Protestant Reformation took place. And had it not been for the outward, visible licentiousness and disorder of the monks of the Roman Catholic Church, they surmised that the Protestant Reformation never would have taken place. And so the Jesuits sought to take over and whip all the monastic orders back into shape so that they once again had the appearance of piety, so that they could continue their diabolical work. All right, that's just an aside. We'll keep going with what the author says here. He says, previous to the elevation of Pope Gregory I to the See of Rome, he was himself an abbot of a monastery and exacted of the monks the strictest observance of the rules of poverty, chastity, and implicit obedience. Okay, so if you're under Pope Gregory I, who controlling this monastic order, you're just an automaton. Okay, and you're sworn to rules of poverty, chastity, and explicit obedience. And it says an instance of superstitious and, as it appears to us, inhuman severity toward one of them is related by Gregory himself and is worth recording as an illustration of the character of Gregory and of the spirit of that superstitious age. The monk's name was Justus. He had practiced physic before entering the monastery. In other words, he was a doctor, and had attended Gregory night and day during his long illness. Being himself taken ill, he discovered at the point of death to his brother, a layman, that he had 3 pieces of gold coin concealed in his cell. Some monks overheard him, and thereupon rummaged his cell, found, after a long search, which nothing could escape, the 3 pieces concealed in a medicament, that is a pill dispensary, and brought them to Gregory. As by the laws of the monastery no monk was to possess anything whatsoever in private, the abbot to bring the dying monk to a due sense of his crime, and at the same time to deter the rest by his punishment from following his example, strictly forbade the other monks to afford him any kind of comfort or relief in the agonies of death, or even to approach him. Okay? So Gregory's going to make an example out of this monk that has spirited away 3 pieces of gold coin. Okay? Not satisfied with that inhuman severity, he required the brother of the unhappy monk to let him know that he died avoided, detested, and abhorred by all his brethren. He did not even stop here, but he exceeded all bounds, ordered the body of the deceased as soon as he expired to be thrown onto a dunghill, that is, where the farmer cleans out the barn, and with it the 3 pieces of gold, all the monks crying aloud, quote, "Thy money perish with thee," unquote. Now, that's for outward consumption. We all know from the record of Avro Manhattan in his book, The Vatican Billions, nobody loves money better than the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? But this is the outward display of piety. This is a punishment. Monks are not to possess anything. They're sworn to poverty. All right? So they find this monk with 3 pieces of gold in his medicine cabinet, and they treated him like a demon himself. And when he died and was cast on the dunghill, all the monks in unison said, "Thy money perish with thee." That's a historical account. It really happened. But what do we know about these monkish orders? They thrive on money. They beg for money. They put out fundraisers all the time. It's all about money. All right? And they serve the Pope, the most money-grubbing demon in the world. Filthy lucre, the Bible calls it. Okay? The Roman Catholic Church is the single richest institution on the planet, exceeding that of many governments of the world. That's what we know from Avro Manhattan's book, The Vatican Billions. So by the outward appearance, you would think that the Roman Catholic Church is poor. As a matter of fact, I read that book, The Vatican Billions, on amateur radio. I read it verbatim. I read it on amateur radio, and I was heard in all 48 states and parts of Canada and Mexico. And despite all the facts that Avro Manhattan, the demonstrable facts that Avro Manhattan put out in his book about the Vatican Billions, people constantly harangued me and heckled me and jammed my transmissions, insisting that the Roman Catholic Church was poor, that it didn't have any money, that they were always begging for money. That is the general perception. That is the ignorance of the people. And that's why they protect the Roman Catholic Church, not knowing a thing about it. It's the same advantage sought by Freemasonry. Oh, the sins that are committed behind a cloak of chastity, charity, and public service. Only God can reveal when He returns in the person of Jesus Christ at the end of the age. God hasten the day. We're following the progression of this doctrine of demons, forbidding to marry. The first thing it did was it elevated the Pope and his celibate priests to godlike status, to be revered in the world. Secondly, and simultaneously, it reduced the God-given state of matrimony between a godly man and a godly woman. It rendered it into a quote-unquote fallen state as somehow less honorable than chastity and celibacy. A fallen state. The institution of marriage still suffers from the stigma that the popery put upon it nearly 2,000 years ago. Okay? This gave rise to monkery, celibate and chaste monks, which gave rise to nunneries and monasteries and a shadow government. Now we're going to see what the institution of monkery brings us: saint worship. See the progression? Remember, the root of all this diabolical transition, the root of it all is the doctrine of demons, forbidding to marry. Now monkery is going to transmute into saint worship and the worship of images and idols and relics. Okay? Subsection 27, beginning of page 92, it says, in an age so dark as that which gave rise to popery, it might be expected that the newly established monastic institutions would produce hundreds of gloomy religionists whom the credulous devotion of an ignorant and superstitious multitude would enshrine as saints. Okay, such we find was actually the fact. In the 6th century, according to Mosheim, the church historian, such was wished to enforce the duties of Christianity by exhibiting examples of piety and virtue to those for whom their institutions were designed, wrote for this purpose the lives of the saints, and there was a considerable number of biographers both among the Greek and Latins. Ennodius Euquipius, Cyril of Scythopolis, Dionysius the Little, Cognitus, and others are to be ranked in this class. But however pious the intentions of these biographers may have been, it must be acknowledged that they executed it in a most contemptible manner. No models of rational piety are to be found among those pretended worthies whom they proposed to Christians as objects of imitation. They amuse their readers with the gigantic fables and trifling romances. The examples they exhibit are those of certain delirious fanaticism, whom they call saints, men of corrupt and perverted judgment, who offered violence to reason and nature by the horrors of an extravagant austerity in their own conduct, and by the severity of those singular and inhuman rules which they prescribed to others. For by what means were these men sainted? By starving themselves with a fanatic obstinacy, and bearing the useless hardships of hunger, thirst, and inclement seasons, with steadfastness and perseverance. By running about the country like madmen, in tattered garments, and sometimes half naked, or shutting themselves up in a narrow space where they continued motionless. By standing for a long time in certain postures with their eyes closed in the enthusiastic expectation of divine light. All this was saint-like and glorious. And the more that any ambitious fanatic departed from the dictates of reason and common sense, and counterfeited the wild gestures and incoherent conduct of an idiot or a lunatic, the surer was his prospect of obtaining an eminent rank among the heroes and the demigods of a corrupt and degenerate church. So the more lunatic you acted, the more superstitiously you were regarded as a saint. This is the history of Roman Catholicism. Now, what does Rome do with their saints? Subsection 28, top of page 60, or rather, top of page 93 says, the origin of Romish errors continued, worship of saints and relics, etc. This is chapter 5. The author says the invocation of saints is another of the unscriptural practices of popery, which boasts of an origin anterior, that is, prior to the papal supremacy. In modern times, this idolatrous worship of created beings has grown to such a height in the Roman Catholic Church as well nigh to exclude all other, or rather, to exclude altogether the worship of the Creator. And whoever will take the trouble to examine a popish book of devotion will see that there are many petitions offered to the saints for every single one that is offered to the deity. In all probability, this practice grew up by degrees from the horrors which in the early ages were paid, or rather, to the honors, rather, which were paid to the martyrs, and those who in the 3rd and 4th century thus laid the foundation of this system of idolatry little imagined the huge fabric of superstition that would be erected thereon. Perhaps it would be too severe to pronounce an indiscriminate censure upon those early Christians who, prompted by the respect for the virtues of their martyred brethren, were accustomed to assemble around their graves and to mourn over their loss and to send up their supplications to the common God and Father of the martyrs dead and the suffering living. In process of time, however, the due reverence with which these witnesses for Jesus had been regarded increased to a kind of idolatrous veneration, and religious services performed over their sepulchres were regarded as possessing a peculiar sanctity and virtue. The growth of this idea was so rapid that in the age of Constantine we find that stately churches were in some instances erected over their graves. And where this was impracticable, some relic, real or imagined, or one of their saints was enshrined with all due solemnity in the magnificent buildings erected to their honor. So now this great apostasy is building huge, expensive churches over the graves, the remains, and the relics of these saints. So they've elevated saints and relics to godlike status. This is Roman Catholicism. And I've covered this many times on Inquisition Update. Roman Catholic canon law says that before Mass can be said over the altar of any Roman Catholic church, it must contain a relic that has been sanctified by the Pope. Either a fragment of skin, bone, hair, fingernails, clothing, a petrified tear must be contained either in or underneath the altar of every Roman Catholic church before the Mass can be said. He said the growth of this idea was so rapid that in the age of Constantine we find that stately churches were in some instances erected over their graves, and where this was impracticable, some relic, real or imaginary, of one of the saints was enshrined with all due solemnity in the magnificent buildings erected to their honor. So who's getting the honor? Is it God? No. It's the Church of Idolatry. Subsection 29, he says, Fleury, the celebrated Roman Catholic ecclesiastical historian, relates that on one occasion in the year 386 A.D., St. Ambrose, being about to consecrate a church in Milan, was prevented by the fact that he had no relics or martyrs to deposit in the altars, when, quote, immediately his heart burned within him in presage as he felt of what was to happen, unquote. The historian proceeds to tell us that God revealed to him in a dream the place where the bodies of St. Gervasius and St. Protasius were to be found. Quote, having discovered their sepulchres, 2 skeletons were discovered of more than ordinary size, all their bones entire, a quantity of blood was found, and their heads separated from their bodies. They arranged the bodies, putting every bone into its proper place, and they covered them with cloths and laid them on litters. In this manner were they carried towards evening to the Basilica of St. Fausta, where vigils were celebrated all night, and several that were possessed received imposition of hands. That day and the next there was a great concourse of people, and then the old men recollected that they had formerly heard the names of these martyrs, and had read the inscription on their tomb. The next day the relics were transferred to the Basilica Ambrosiana, unquote, or the Church of St. Ambrose in Milan. So general had the notion become that a church could not be consecrated without relics, that it was decreed by the Council of Constantinople that on those altars under which no relics were found should be demolished. Okay? So we have Constantinople stepping in and saying any church, any Roman Catholic church that doesn't have relics under or within its altars should be demolished. And of course, if you've seen the Roman Catholic churches, they are magnificent edifices, the cost of which can't even be calculated, some of them. So, what was the answer? Put relics in the altar to keep your church from being destroyed. Forced idolatry. Never mind what the Scriptures say. Never mind that Jesus was the sacrifice of the altar of heaven. You've got to have sacrifices in the church. You've got to have sacrifices of the Mass. And before you can do that, you have to have a relic of one of the saints of the Roman Catholic Church encased in the altar or underneath. See what the doctrine of demons leads to? Now, for the same necessity of relics to be deposited in the altar of Romish churches, in order to their due consecration, is contended for down to the present day. Okay? This is still a requirement. Any and every Roman Catholic church, new, old, or otherwise, must have a relic in the altar. And it says, no matter how minute the particle of proposed holy dust or the saint to whom the church is to be dedicated, either a tooth or a toenail or a hair or a drop of blood or a preserved tear from the eye, anything will do, so that it has been christened and declared genuine by His infallible holiness, the Pope. Okay? So here's the kicker. If you're going to put an image and an idol underneath the altar of the Roman Catholic Church, some relic, it has to be consecrated by the Pope, or your church is destroyed. So who gets the credit for all of this? Your relic isn't a relic unless it's blessed by the Pope. You see how the papacy acquires more power, more religious power? That's the whole system of Rome. It's about elevating the papacy to godlike status. He says, upon the arrival of the duly authenticated relic, it's duly authenticated because the Pope blessed it, okay? It says, upon the arrival of the duly authenticated relic, it is borne in solemn procession by priests in their robes to the altar in which it is to be deposited, and when arrived at its destination, it is placed by the hands of the bishop himself in the place prepared for its reception. The first of the adjoining plates, now he's talking about woodcuts that are included in this book, where they actually show a picture of this procession leading the relic into the church in a most solemn fashion on a litter carried high upon the shoulders of those who carry the litter. It is brought with great pomp and circumstance and worshipful veneration into the church before it is placed by the very hands of the bishop, the most powerful man in the realm, into the altar of the Roman Catholic Church. It says the first of the adjoining plates represents the procession of the relic into the church, and the other, the bishop in the act of closing up the sacred deposit within the altar. Before he does this, he marks the sepulchre on the four sides with the sign of the cross. This is the consecration of the sepulchre. He then deposits the relic box with all possible veneration, which must be done bareheaded, the better to testify to the congregation the reverence attached to the ceremony. After this, an anthem is repeated, during which the celebrant, still without his mitre on, incenses the relic, shakes his little smoking device with incense in it, incenses the relics, and afterwards puts it on, takes the stone which is to be laid over the sepulchre with his right hand, dips the thumb of the other hand in chrism, that's holy water, and makes the sign of the cross in the middle of the stone on the side that is to be toward the relic, in order to consecrate it on that side. Anthems and oremus immediately follow according to custom. After this, the celebrant fixes the stone upon the sepulchre, the masons make an end of the work, and the celebrant sanctifies it by the sign of the cross, which is reverently to be made on the stone. Now, these images are all contained here in the book. You can see them for yourself. Not one part of this is sanctioned in the Bible. Why? Because it's rank idolatry, forbidden by the second commandment of God. All of it. It's as if the Roman Catholic Church is trying to testify outwardly, publicly, all over the world. Every time a Roman Catholic Church is sanctified, it's trying to display for everyone to see that it is the church of Antichrist. It's a church of idolatry. We are to have no fellowship with idolatry. You see how perfectly easy it is to discover who the Antichrist is? But you know what Christians believe today? Yes, the Bible teaches us about Jesus. It even prophesies the very words that he would say on the cross when he was crucified. It prophesies all his miracles, all of his raising the dead, all of his making the blind to see and the lame to walk. Prophesies of him being born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the womb of a virgin. Prophesies everything so that no one would be ignorant of the time of the visitation of Christ. And yet, those same people who believe that Jesus is the Christ and that he died for our sins, that he was the only begotten Son of the Father, sent by the Father to rescue us from a Christless eternity by taking our own sins upon his own sinless body and making restitution and propitiation and reconciliation to the Father. That same Father would turn around and leave us ignorant about who the Antichrist is. That's what they believe. They believe that the Antichrist is not known yet in the world. He hasn't appeared yet. Really? You think God would deal so treacherously with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus who died at the hands of the Antichrist? Do you think he left the world ignorant as to who this Antichrist would be? If the Antichrist is not to come until 7 years before Christ returns, why was Paul warning about him 2,000 years ago? I'll leave it to my listeners to list their own questions and send them to me here at tom@cwaves.us. If what is taught in the churches today is to be believed, how do you explain how God deals so fast and loose with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus? How treacherously he abuses the blood of his own Son, leaving us to be tempted and dubious about the identity of Antichrist. To me, futurism is blasphemy. to believe and teach that the Antichrist of the Bible is a single individual that comes within 7 or 3.5 years before Christ's literal return is blasphemy, because it suggests that the Father sent His Son to redeem us and then left us clueless who could deceive us. And we find, if we read church history, which is extant in the world, I'm reading it for you, God's people always knew who the Antichrist was. There was never a question in their mind. And every act of idolatry, every act of indecency, every act of war, crusade, every incestuous act by the popes and the priests, every sexual depravity, all of it was seen as positively identifying that which Paul prophesied to come immediately after the Caesars were taken out of the way. The Antichrist, the man of sin, that wicked. And all of history has begged the world to come to its senses and acknowledge the papacy for what it is. And here we are today, 2,000 years after Christ graciously died in our behalf. We're still ignorant about who the Antichrist is. It's unspeakable ignorance. No, it's not ignorance. It's deception. And that deception comes in the very person of futurism. That which suggests that the papacy is not, never was, never will be the Antichrist, as all the Protestants throughout history maintained, but it's one single individual who has not come into the world yet, who has not signed yet a 7-year peace treaty with the Jews to let them build their temple again and begin animal sacrifices again, so that they may eat and drink damnation to themselves, once again demonstrating that they've rejected the Son of the living God, the Lamb of God, the perfect sacrifice for man, and seek to sacrifice animals once again, never comprehending that it's the papacy behind it all. Never comprehending that the Roman Catholic Church and the popes themselves wrote this alternative interpretation of Bible prophecy to exonerate the papacy from the undeniable accusation of Antichrist. The churches of this world are completely apostate. There isn't one that should be called a sanctuary for anyone who calls himself a Christian. They are all corrupt. They should be abandoned. And we should worship God according to Scripture, not the imaginations of a devious mind.